Hi, my name is Joakim Vindenes. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Bergen, and I'll be presenting mine and Barbara Wasson's paper, Show, Don't Tell, using Goalong interviews in Immersive Virtual Reality. This paper is describing the VR Goalong as a method for studying users' relations to virtual environments, as well as their user experience of virtual environments, and allows the study of embodied interaction as embedded in the virtual environments to which they refer. So, what are Goalong interviews? Goalong interviewing is an emerging qualitative research method in which both researcher and interviewee are immersed in and navigates within a context relevant to the interview. So the method is combining observation with interviewing. Although Goalong interviewing is usually performed by tending to physical environments in ethnographical studies, we argue that the method also holds promise for use in environments mediated through immersive VR in order to study user experience. So because VR applications are not just tools, but environments in which we exist, spend time and move around in, performing Goalong interviews in VR can provide possibilities for being attentive to a broader range of the virtually mediated experience. Being co-present in the virtual environment can provide communicative benefits similar to those reported in physical Goalong interviews. For instance, whereas in a traditional sit-down interview, the participant would have to provide verbal descriptions of the virtual environment and her interactions within it retrospectively, being in VR can allow the participant to demonstrate interactions with the virtual environment in situ. Being present with the participant in the virtual environment can also aid the researcher, who can draw on observations to ask more informed questions. Also, performing VR Goalong interviews can evoke participants' memories of past experiences within the environment, as well as provide access to the participant's current flow of experience as it is unfolding within the particular context. Lastly, the method can also help to alter power dynamics between researcher and participant, as the participant can take the lead and introduce the environment on their own terms. So, in other words, what we are arguing is that VR can provide its own context, where experiences are tied to the virtual environment. The potential benefits of conducting interviews in VR, therefore, is that it considers experience as well as embodied interaction in relation to the virtual environment. Luff and colleagues has argued that conceptions of embodied interaction that only considers the bodily interaction is insufficient because the interaction takes place in relation to the environment which it occurs in. So by performing Goalong interviews in VR, the user's experience and embodied interaction can be seen and understood in relation to the virtual environment. Now, we use the Goalong method to inquire into our participants' experience of creating a virtual mind palace. A virtual mind palace can be defined as a visual spatial structuring of information comparable to a three-dimensional mind map. For this study, the participants could define the role of the virtual environment more or less as they wished, within the broader focus of approaching meaningful virtual worlds of information. We used the open source project Mozilla Hubs to host these environments. By creating one's own instance of Hubs Cloud, it is possible for the users to insert images, 3D models, videos, 3D drawings, etc. into their environments in order to create their personalized VR mind palace. For this study, 10 participants were given an Oculus Quest to use in their homes to create a mind palace with a theme in which they were more or less interested, for instance outlining one's favorite books. The study ran over 1 week. However, the participants were not required to use the Quest every day. Instead, we kindly asked that participants visited and interacted with the environment at minimum 3 separate occasions during the week. The researcher was not present during this week, only in the interview that followed. So, we conducted a thematic analysis on the gathered interview data to search for common themes in how our participants communicated about their experiences in and through VR as a means to evaluate our interviewing approach. Concretely, the following question focused our analysis. How do the participants choose to communicate about their experiences? Thus, the analysis was concerned with modes of communication. What emerged from our analysis was the significant extent to which our participants communicated in other ways than the spoken language during the interview. Participants gestured communicatively, pointed and referred to content, and demonstrated interactions with the virtual environment during the interview. Also, how they directed their gaze, the way they positioned themselves within the virtual environment, contributed to communication in various ways. I will now present the themes and the codes that constitute each theme of the analysis, as well as show some video examples. These are without sound because of participant anonymity, as well as the fact that the interviews were performed in Norwegian. So the three themes were demonstrating interactions, referencing virtual content, and nonverbal communication. Now for the demonstrating interactions, we can see here the first in the video is Josh showing how he can't really move down the stairs, thus demonstrating a bug. We also here see a participant drawing around three objects to illustrate an interaction feature they would actually like to have, the ability to group objects. But the most common one was to instantiate objects in order to interact with them and thus also show how they found interacting with the system, what worked, what was desirable, what was not desirable, and so on. So this is showing how the participants are actively utilizing the common ground between them and the researcher in order to communicate in the interview. Also referencing virtual content. Now this is referring to such things as pointing to sites of action or experience, casual gestures towards the objects in the virtual mind palace, showing the way by means of gestures, navigating objects as part of the guided tour, as well as pinpointing concrete objects to be specific in their speech. What was very common here was to alternate looking at the researcher and the objects as we were discussing the different objects in the virtual mind palace. The last theme is nonverbal communication. This is of course already present in the other examples that you've seen, but here serves to designate the more subtle ways of nonverbal communication, such as holding eye contact, nodding, using communicative hand gestures, as well as just looking at the environment and orienting oneself as into where you are. So how does one conduct VR Goalong interviews? Well, the researcher should be immersed in the environment of relevance with the participant. The researcher should also move around with the participant in the virtual environment during the interview and be open to the possibility of the environment shaping or informing the interview. Lastly, the researcher's role should be that of a visiting guest, and the focus should be on what the environment means for the participant. So, what studies stand to benefit from the VR Goalong method? Well, we see the VR Goalong method as particularly relevant for studies in which the digital context that the participants are immersed in are of importance for situating their experiences. So examples here include remote work collaboration, VR learning environments, cultural heritage, virtual tourism, as well as emerging social VR worlds, such as VR chat and Space VR. The method can also be particularly useful in close studies of embodied interaction in VR. We found that when performing VR Goalong interviews in the virtual mind palaces, where the various interactional activities were distributed across the virtual environment, our participants would interact with the system as they told us how they experienced interacting with the system, actively utilizing the presence of the virtual environment in their explanations. So while they were doing this, we were able to clearly view their bodily engagement with the VR system. Now, the method also holds promise for usability evaluation. We were, for instance, able to gain a highly detailed understanding of usability issues where sometimes participants would have to enter into physically uncomfortable positions in order to interact with the system. There is here a possibility of conducting think aloud sessions in VR, where the participant can be observed and think aloud while the researcher is present in the environment. Further research should look into the possibility beyond what has been shown in this paper. So, to conclude, Goalong interviewing is an emerging qualitative research method where researcher and interviewee go together to a location relevant for the research. We found that benefits reported in traditional Goalong interviewing were also attainable when the method was mediated through immersive VR. The interlocutors shared present in the virtual environment allowed for a common ground beneficial for communication. So being in VR enabled our participants to demonstrate interaction spontaneously and by providing a guided tour, show us relevant objects and locations in their virtual mind palace on their own terms. So we argue that the VR Goalong method is a useful tool for eliciting contextual phenomenological accounts of virtual environments. Thank you.